how can we build frustration tolerance? Because things are going to be frustrating.
Oh, hell yeah.
Exactly. It's not about avoiding the frustration, and it's not about working around a way so that you don't become frustrated. It's about building the discipline to tolerate frustration. And that is something that I think as a culture we could do a much better job. And the way in which I think that we do that is that we place ourselves knowingly in frustrating situations and we tell ourselves, I'm not going to quit. This is going to suck and you should bring it on. Mm-hmm. And you cultivate that muscle just like you would be in the gym cultivating a squat. So it can be very calculated, a very particular thing, you know, that can be frustrating for an individual, and you do it. And you know it's going to suck, and you still challenge yourself to do it. And you build the muscle to tolerate the frustration. You build your muscle to tolerate boredom. Mm-hmm. And you understand that quitting is not an option.
Mm-hmm. That's very fair. That's a very fair expectation. And do you have a way that you've seen people build tolerance to frustration?
Oh, of course. Writing my own book. Mm-hmm. Writing, and you've written like 4 or 5 books.
3 books, yeah.
Yeah. There's a frustration in that initial phase of trying to write the book. And that's so frustrating. You know how many times you just want to get up and quit? And the way you do it is you understand that you just sit down and it is, oh my God, totally frustrating. Mm-hmm. Or even with your kids, like how many times do you have to tell them to flush the toilet? You know, just like,
simple things. And then,
simple things.
Yeah.
And mitigating the visceral response is really valuable. Mitigating, right? One of the things is we know that as high as you go is as low as you're going to drop. So there's a dopamine hit. As high as that dopamine is going to go is as low as it's going to drop. So mitigating the interpretation of the experience of everything being high and low and making a big deal about things. Mm-hmm. I think if we can mitigate the importance of things in the moment, does that make sense, right? Yeah. So if I sit down to write this book and I'm making such a big deal in my head, then it's going to increase that frustration as opposed to, okay, I didn't know what the sentence was. It doesn't have to be a narrative about it or some monologue or dialogue within myself. It's just this thing. I'm going to execute this thing. I'm going to sit it down for 10 minutes and I'm going to build my frustration muscle and I'm going to execute on it. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to take a 10-minute break and then I'm going to do it again.
Mm-hmm. I so hear you, and you're so right, because I feel it's the same, like you said, it's the same story when you're writing a book, building a muscle, building a business, working with kids. Everywhere in our lives, we are kind of building some version of our frustration muscle. And that's where I'm like, it's an interesting concept. I want to explore this more, if not in this dialogue at some point, because it's one of those things that I still don't have a science to say, hey, how does somebody build that? I think I have a pretty good frustration muscle. I can get through anything. Like
exposure. You build it through exposure and practice.
And how do we mitigate that going into the future? I know this has nothing to do with what you sat down to talk about, but because one of my biggest concerns as a parent is that my kids have an extraordinarily simple life. I had a really tough life as I grew up. I grew up in India in a house of 23 people sharing the same space. So I grew up in, tough circumstances. I have a huge frustration muscle probably because of that, because everything was so frustrating around me. But that doesn't happen anymore because life is incredibly abundant at this point. Not just for me, like generally life is incredibly abundant, even in India at this point. So what is it that you're thinking about, if you're thinking about it at all, is we need to do for the next generation so they can build the frustration muscle? Because I think there's some learning for our generation in that too.
I actually had a great conversation with a friend of mine. His name is Remy Adeleke, and we talked about parenting his 4 kids. And he is a former Navy SEAL. Now he's a writer, producer, amazing. And he grew up very tough. He grew up in the Bronx in New York. And one of the things that we talked about was the concept that the way in which we raise our kids, things aren't going to go right. And no, you don't get a participation trophy. And the reality is it starts with us. It starts with how we model things and how we respond to their experiences. They may not ever have to run through the streets, God willing, right? And I don't want that for them. But there are ways to cultivate some of that strength by just navigating daily life. No, my daughter doesn't get a participation trophy.
But the school gives that here, right? Isn't it?
I mean,
that's where they are so many hours in the day.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? But when you come home, it's, you know, these are the things that you have to do. You can't always get what you want. There are rules and in place in this home. This is how we respect people. This is how we clean things. You know, these are the ways that we do. No, you can't have that toy because you didn't earn your allowance. And she's only 3, but we're starting to work on teaching her these things.
It makes perfect sense. And maybe this is applicable to us ourselves as individuals by putting a reward system within our lives to say, oh, you don't get to do X if you don't do Y or something like that.
Absolutely.
So it kind of automatically builds small, but over time, a big enough muscle.
And how about simply saying, you know what, I really want a coffee, but I'm going to not buy Starbucks for the next week. Even if you can afford it.
Yeah.
But to actually do something that is uncomfortable or a little bit restrictive, I think is very beneficial.
And that might be the way to start building that frustration muscle.
Or
is to just go create restrictions, manufacture them, just so that you could
doing a little bit of a hard thing every day or something. And maybe that's not it, but, you know, saying, oh, gosh, I already worked out once today, but, you know, I'm going to go do 5 sprints and I really don't want to do it. I mean, that's something silly, but it's actually creating a bit of discomfort so that you know that you can tolerate it. And I think that can be very valuable.